Okay guys, quick tip for today. I'm going to show you why you should avoid using auto exposure for shooting video and how you can lock it down for better, more consistent results. For this demo, I am using my DJI Mini 2. My white balance is set manually and my exposure is set to auto. My exposure doesn't look too bad, but I think it could be a touch brighter. So to do that, I'm going to tap on EV or exposure value, and I'm just going to boost it up 0.3. which I think looks much better. Now, watch what happens when I start to fill the frame with this black card. The scene instantly gets brighter as the camera system increases the exposure to compensate for what it thinks is an overly dark scene. Our light didn't change, but our exposure did. This time I'm going to introduce a white card. This example is not quite as dramatic, but you can see that things get darker as the camera system compensates for what it thinks is an overly bright scene. Now, imagine this same thing happening when you're flying your drone. You want to capture this beautiful, bright, white, snowy field, but instead it ends up looking very gray and dull. Or perhaps you were shooting a lush, deep green forest, yet on your screen it appears too bright and washed out. The takeaway here is that when shooting in auto, your exposure is constantly being evaluated and adjusted based on what is filling the camera's frame. To avoid inconsistency and sometimes just plain bad exposures, we need to either lock our exposure or switch to manual camera settings. If you're shooting in auto, it is very simple to lock your exposure. In the DJI Fly app, just tap on any blank space on the screen to bring up the exposure control. Tap again inside the yellow box and hold your finger down until the message Auto Exposure Locked appears. With exposure locked, it doesn't matter what fills the frame, the exposure will remain unchanged. You can unlock the exposure by tapping any blank space on the screen or by adjusting any of the camera settings. Now, let me just state for the record here that I do not like the camera control for locking auto exposure. It's way too fiddly and too easy to disengage. On earlier versions of the Fly app, auto exposure lock was a simple lock icon, which made much more sense to me. I would be really happy if DJI went back to that, but I'm not holding my breath. Anyhow, the other way to ensure consistent exposure is to use Pro mode, which is essentially just manual camera settings. That is beyond the scope of this video, but stay tuned because I will be doing a tutorial about it in the future. Okay, so one last thing I want to mention here with auto exposure lock is that you always want to start with a good exposure. So how do you do that? Well, basically with your drone in the air and ready to shoot, you want your camera pointing to a neutral scene. So nothing too bright, nothing too dark, just a mixed scene with a bit of everything. If what you see with your eyes looks like what you're seeing on your screen, you're probably good to go and you can lock it down. Now, there may be times when you have to override what the camera system thinks is correct exposure. Going back to my bright snowy field example, if I simulate that with this white card, you can see that auto exposure makes the scene a dull, boring gray rather than what it should be. To fix that, we have to use exposure compensation. To do that, tap on EV and lighten or darken the scene as needed before locking your exposure. In this case, we need to brighten things up quite a bit, probably somewhere around plus 1.7. That looks pretty good. So now we can lock it down, and when we remove the white card, we see our scene is properly exposed. Cool, right? One last point I want to make here is don't get too hung up on getting a perfect exposure. Just get it as close as you can, and then if it's not quite right, you can adjust it in post. I do that all the time, and it's no big deal. What's more important is that your exposure is consistent, and that just makes your footage look better and much more professional. Well, that's it for this one, guys. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, I'd totally appreciate a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and yeah, I guess I'll see you next time. Bye.